All right. Well, welcome to another Afterthoughts with Kaylee and Lee. And we're into the new year and we're into our series on fear. And so I had some good feedback actually from not just the sermon on Sunday, but good feedback from Afterthoughts video. That's nice because it's our first foray into it's kind of like a cross between this is a small group format / podcast / engagement in the service. Yeah. You know, we sit and talk, and I mean it fits. I think it fits with current media culture, right? There's something kind of like new and exciting about it. Fun. But I think it also relates really back to like, what does it look like to engage as a whole family into a discussion? And I like that. So this is just doing what we've always done in a new way. Yeah. So anyway, so this week, we talked about the fear of the Lord and how that's different than like the fear of worry and anxiety or terror or being paralyzed by fear. That this is good fear, but it's just different. So, you know, I guess because you always ask me is like, well, why don't we start with the recap? Why don't I just go straight into the recap?
Great.
Because I know the question you're going to ask.
It's coming. So go for it.
It's good. For me, like ultimately when it came down to, you know, talking about the fear of the Lord, it's there's a lot of times where it's like the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge or the beginning of wisdom, or like you can tell right away, like even in the context of the Psalm or the proverb or wherever you find it, there is something that is very good about this fear of the Lord. And so, and if you've grown up in church at all, and this is what I said, if you've grown up in church, I think you automatically understand when you see the words, you know, the fear of the Lord is, or we're to fear the Lord, and there's a good context behind it. We automatically go, well, that's reverence or that's respect. Right. And so I just challenged people just to kind of think about like, what about alignment too, right? Alignment to Jesus, like fixing your eyes on Jesus that we read about in Hebrews, because he's the author and the perfecter of our faith. And so, you know, get rid of the things that entangle us, like the things that draw us away from obeying God, which is ultimately sin, right? And so to get rid of those things, but to reorient or to realign yourself with Jesus at the center. So, and I mean, ultimately, I guess that's what preaching is almost every Sunday to a certain degree, is like just calling people to an awareness of where are you at in your alignment with God. Yeah. In a variety of ways, whether it's like learning from a parable or a scripture or from Jesus, or whether it's a thought or a theme, or like it's really always about like learning a little bit more about this is who God is. This is how he's made us. This is where he's created us. To know him is to be in awe of him and to be in reverence of him. And so then you recognize, well, I need to align myself with the one who created all of this, because his creation was built a certain way. And to thrive a certain way in that creation is to align with him. So
honestly, I wanted to start with a simple question for people. I wanted to, because even as you mentioned it, like if you've grown up in the church, the words "the fear of the Lord" aren't all that alarming necessarily. But if you haven't, you might be like, "What are you talking about?" In the sense of like, that makes me feel something that's not great, maybe. And so I think it would be cool to share with your group, or think to yourself if you're doing this solo. When you hear the words, the fear of the Lord, what comes to mind? Okay, so you referenced how in current culture, a lot of what we do is we ask ourselves what pleases us. And but as followers of Jesus, he asks us to learn what pleases him. So I thought it would be sweet in our groups to share with one another, or ask yourself, what pleases God? What comes to mind when you ask yourself the question? So don't overthink it, or feel like you have to give any sort of, academic response. For example, I think of everything from like being intentional with my girls to apologizing to Mark, or to worship singing my heart out in the car by myself. Like it can be any number of things that kind of pop to your mind. So I thought it would be fun to share when you hear the words, what pleases God, what comes to mind for you?
Well,
you.
what is interesting too is the weirdness of sometimes what pleases me also pleases God, but there are things that please me that don't please God, and there are things that please God that I actually don't get a lot of pleasure in, but I have to learn it, right? Or at least understand it so that I can go, oh no, wait, that is good for me, right? Like self-discipline. I don't know, like there are people who are wired for self-discipline,
Right.
and I know self-discipline it pleases God. There's a lot of places where that is mentioned, even in the 2 Timothy, where we talked about last week of a spirit of self-discipline or self-control.
Right.
And so, I don't like self-discipline. It actually doesn't give me pleasure at all, but I know that it is very good for me.
Right.
And I get the pleasure of almost the consequence of doing self-discipline because I find myself, reliant on him and all of that. So this pleasure thing can be tricky because I go, well, I find golf pleasurable and it can lead me into a presence of God. And it also can lead me very far away from the presence of God, depending on how I'm doing. So it's a good question of,
Thanks for your mug.
You're welcome.
I appreciate it.
Yep. You talked about it last week of like you almost used my mug and you're like, oh, I couldn't. And I was like, of course you could. So now I got to gift you by making you a tea.
Even when I reposted the video in the email and I heard myself talking about doing it and I felt sweaty. It was ridiculous.
That's fantastic.
That's horrible.
Oh.
Okay, I wanted to reread. There's a text you referenced, and honestly, as I read it, I was like, "Oh, I want to sit in that." And so maybe this is kind of like a tie-in. So I'm gonna maybe ask the question first, and then read and listen, and then kind of ask you what stands out as you hear these words, because I think they're really potent. So Deuteronomy 10:12. And then 20 to 21 says, "And now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is your praise. He is your God, who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes." I just feel like that's a scripture we can sit in and read over. So maybe reread right now to yourself or with your group.
Deuteronomy 10:12 and then 20 to 21.
Yeah. And just kind of ask yourselves, what stands out? Is it to walk in his ways? Is it his awesome wonders? What hits you there? Yeah.
Yeah, I think when I referenced C.S. Lewis from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where they describe Aslan, which is, the figure that represents God, right? And that to me, like the fear of the Lord is a little bit of I think he understood it, like the awe and the reverence, without getting into I am fearing the lightning bolt from the sky,
right?
Kind of fear where people get to. And he's like, is he safe? Well, no, he's not safe, but he is good. And I think for us to kind of wrap our minds around that too is good. So yeah, like I said, I really looked forward to preaching this one. And I'm sure we'll come back to it in the weeks to come too, as we deal with fear, to be reminded of the one that we serve that frees us from that. So
cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. See you later.